We are now live.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the House Environment Committee and a new session for 2026. Today we're going to begin our deep dive into water with our Legislative Counsel, Michael O'Grady. Welcome back, Michael.
Okay. Hi, my name is Michael O'Grady. I'm with Legislative Counsel. I'm going to stand to do this PowerPoint because I want to be able to point to certain things on the screen, and I just think that's easier to do from a standing perspective.
And I just want to, before you start, ask members to take a deep breath, be open. We have a lot of time with Michael, and I want us to really, I had a chance to look at the PowerPoint earlier, and it really helped me. So what I want us to do is we're just like level set with our understanding of water law and where we are in Vermont. So feel free to ask questions. And then we're going to hear from two other witnesses this afternoon. We don't have an unlimited amount of time, but I do want folks to feel comfortable really absorbing what's being presented.
So the chair asked me to do an overview of water and water law, and water issues in the state. And I'm going to do my best, but I'm not going to be able to address everything. And the PowerPoint doesn't include everything I'm going to refer to. If you want something that I'm referring to, but that's not in the PowerPoint or linked to in the PowerPoint, let me know. I can provide you that resource. But there's so much in this subject matter that I couldn't really put everything into a PowerPoint. And you'll see that as I go through. With that said, ask questions. If something is, I'm talking about something and you think it relates to something of interest to you, ask me a question. I should be able to at least respond and give you information related to this. So let's start. So when the chair asked me to talk about water, I was like, what's the best way to, start out organizationally? And I think the best way is to look at A&R at the Department of Environmental Conservation's divisions and what they do. You'll see generally there's a lot of, entries here, but it really lists about 12 to 15 divisions at DEC. And when you look at how many of them are involved with water, 5 of them are involved with water. So 5 out of 15 divisions at DEC are water related. Now I'm going to focus on drinking water and groundwater, watershed management, and water investment. But Vermont PFAS, that's a big deal right now. And how to respond to that, how to deal with it in groundwater, how to provide safe drinking water, that's a big deal. Village wastewater solutions, you're all talking about housing right now. Wastewater is a big driver of housing. So again, I'm not going to talk about it specifically today, but that's a pretty important division at DEC. So let's talk about the drinking water and groundwater. So first, the mission of this division is to protect human health and the environment for current and future generations and protect the quality and quantity of groundwater and regulate wastewater disposal. Well, that's great, but when you look at the specifics of this division, they do a lot. They do PFAS in drinking water. They do public drinking water, and that's just not your municipal public system. It's any public drinking water system, and that includes schools, that includes business offices, that includes basically any place where people are going to be served by a well and that they're going to be there for a general specific amount of time or expected amount of time, or a certain amount of people will be coming in and out of that structure. So they do that. They do wastewater system and potable water supply. That's your wells and your septic. They do indirect discharge. That's when you're discharging onto the ground, and it's not necessarily into a water or otherwise. This is very important for community-based septic systems. That's basically what a community-based septic system is given a permit under, indirect discharge. If you're going to have housing on community-based systems, indirect discharge is the permit that you're going to need. Underground injection control, discharging waste into the ground. Groundwater, just extraction of it, use of it. irrigation. So those are the major things that this division does, and they do a lot. How do I know that they do a lot? Because this division issues the most permits of any division at A&R, and nobody knows that. And they do it really pretty well. You know, even though you're hearing from constituents about the cost of the septic system, or I can't put my well in because my neighbor overshadowed my property, this division issues most of its permits, like 93% of the time, on time. So, and I'm not talking about like 5 permits or 10 permits, it's like close to 1,000 permits a year.
What do you mean by your neighbor overshadowed your property?
So underneath the wastewater system and potable water supply program, you need to have certain isolation distances around your well or your wastewater system. If you put your well in first, your isolation distance can extend onto neighboring property, and they cannot do certain activities in that area. And that's called overshadow.
Like,
Can you give us an example of an underground injection?
But we don't do it much in Vermont. But there, you know, the most recent kind of high profile one was out of Hawaii. There was a wastewater plant that was injecting waste into the ground, into wells in the ground. And they thought that it was being dealt with, but it turns out that it was seeping out into the ocean. And so there's all types of injection, underground injection, for waste or water, or sometimes when you're gonna store gas, you can store gas under an underground injection control.
But we don't do that here.
We don't do much of it at all. We have a program, it's a delegated EPA program, but we don't do much of it in Vermont. Next division I want to talk about is water investment. You're like, what is this? You know, do we really need a whole division for water investment? When you look at this program, the answer is clearly yes. Because the first thing that they do is that they coordinate the investment of state and federal funding and all types of clean water and drinking water infrastructure in your town's municipal discharge system treatment plant, in your town's public water system, and community-based water systems, either water or wastewater. They do all of that. And they used to only provide their assistance to municipalities, but the federal government has started basically allowing more activities to be funded underneath their money, which allows the state to fund more programs. So you'll get some private funding for wastewater and water underneath this program as well. But what are they investing? You know, what is the state and federal funding? Well, the first big source is under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Federal Clean Water Act. One of the main components of both of those acts is it gives money to the states. Every year, the state gets money from the federal government based on our population. So that puts us like, you know, down there on the list of states that receive funding. But in 2025, drinking water got $40 million. 2025, clean water got $20 million. We generally get between $20 and $30 million a year for both of those programs every year from the feds. That sounds like a lot, but it's not enough. It's so much not enough that A&R had to come up with the rule on how it was going to prioritize applications for this money. And so they have a standalone rule that grants points to applicants and creates a list that municipalities or applicants climb each year as other projects. Like each year you get an additional point for the year you've been in the application process. And that drives awards to these municipalities, your municipalities, pretty much every year. Now, one of the things that people like to think about is like, oh, we have this money and hey, we want to prioritize housing. So this year, we're going to say that housing from now on is going to get priority over everything else. And that's when your town managers come to you and say, hey, I've been in this program waiting for 7 years. And now you're going to tell me I have to wait another 5 to get this money to redo my public water system. So remember that the money is there. It's there for your towns. It's there for your water and wastewater, but it can't just be grabbed. And when you try to grab it, which I've tried to draft, your towns tell you don't do that. Now, another aspect of this division, there's 2 kind of unusual aspects of this division. They run the dam safety program. And Ben Green, they do the rules, they do the inspections, they're doing the permitting. Water investment does that. And why does water investment do that? Because the other kind of unusual aspect of this division is they house facilities engineering. This whole program used to be called facilities engineering, and nobody knew what the heck it was. What is facilities engineering? It's literally the engineers for the entire agency. They are the people that design things for the state, for A&R, like state parks, like water systems for state lands. There are engineers that do that, and they help the dam safety program. The dam safety program needs its own people, but that's why dam safety is here, because the engineers are here, because the engineers help move this money. So the engineers, dam safety, water investment, you would think which 2 things don't belong together? Well, they actually do belong together. And then the next one, this is the diva. This is what everybody knows. This is the high profile stuff. This is the stuff you hear from your constituents about. This is the stuff in the media. It's the brown water pictures. It's the CSOs. It's all of that. This is watershed management. So it's
Diva.
It's CAFOs, it's lakes and ponds, so wake boats, aquatic nuisance. That's that. Monitoring and assessment. You might not know what that means, but that's where you get TMDLs. That's where they go out and they assess whether or not the state is meeting its water quality standards. And then if not, determine what the plan should be. Rivers, that's stream alteration. That's NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program. It's river corridors. It's buffers. Stormwater, you've all heard of stormwater. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Wastewater, wetlands. We're going to talk about wetlands a little bit later. This is the high profile stuff. Now remember, the groundwater division issues more permits than these people do. These people, this division, they get all the glory and the not so much glory. And why? Why do they do that? Sorry. Well, they're responsible for protecting, maintaining, enhancing, and restoring quality of Vermont surface water. When later on, you'll see how much of that is in the state. And it's inherent in this effort to support both healthy ecosystems and public uses. Vermont's 800 lakes and ponds and 23,000 miles of rivers and streams and 300,000 acres of wetlands. Those numbers are a little out of date, but we'll come back to them a little later on. So there are 3 kind of specific high profile wetlands, rivers, and lakes. Then we talked about stormwater and wastewater. We talked about monitoring and assessment. Now, stormwater and wastewater, they run permitting programs. You're all familiar with those permits, I believe. We'll talk about them in a minute. But they also provide operational support services. They talk to people about how to do what they need to do, what permits they need to do, how to get money. This isn't just a regulator. It's somebody that supports the regulated community as well. Now, why are we doing that? Why? You know, there's the underlying, well, we all need to drink water. We all need to discharge our own water. We all need to eat, which requires water, etc. But there are specific federal requirements under both the Federal Clean Water Act, Federal Safe Drinking Water Act that require states to do this. I talked to you already about how the state regulates public water supplies and public water systems. That's because it's required by the Safe Drinking Water. The Safe Drinking Water Act doesn't want people going into buildings and going into structures and drinking water for public use and it being unhealthy or contaminated. So they develop standards that the states have to follow in order to properly run public water systems. Now, EPA has kind of what's called override authority for drinking water. They can come in and say, hey, you're doing this wrong. We want you to do it this way. But generally, they kind of delegate these programs to the states. So the states can adopt stronger standards if they want, as long as they're otherwise compliant with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And you've seen this. PFAS, when it first was an issue in Bennington, the state was one of the first states to come up with the PFAS drinking water standard. The feds have subsequently gone way past what Vermont did. Vermont was at a 20 parts per million standard. The feds over the past 3 or 5 years went to 5 parts per million for 5 different types of PFAS. And so we were kind of first in time, but we're no longer the most stringent or most protective.
The parts per trillion.
It is parts per trillion.
That was from the vice chair, just amplifying his note.
And I should know that because the groundwater protection strategy and rule is up for LCAR approval on Thursday. And the main changes are about lowering the PFAS standards to the federal standards.
That's what's being proposed in that rule.
Yes, yes, with some other technical changes. And the other federal requirements come from the Federal Clean Water Act. And the Federal Clean Water Act does a lot of things. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But it was first enacted in 1948, and it was called the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. And that's still technically its name. Well, does anybody know what happened in like the late 60s and early 70s that spurred the Clean Water Act? First caught fire. The Cuyahoga River caught fire. And they couldn't put it out. It burned for 3 days. And apparently it wasn't unusual for rivers to catch fire back prior to the Clean Water Act. But it was unusual that they couldn't put it out for 3 days. And then Time Magazine put a picture of it on the front cover of Time Magazine. And that led to a lot of popular sentiment for regulation of clean water and discharges to clean water. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act prior to 1972 was kind of it wasn't really regulator based. It was like, hey, businesses, you're required to do this. These are the things that you need to do to take on. And there wasn't a lot of enforcement of it. After 1972, EPA became involved, was created, and became the enforcer of multiple different aspects of the Clean Water. And so the Clean Water Act is intended to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution in the nation's water in order to restore, and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water. And it does that in multiple ways. It requires states to adopt water quality requirements. It requires permitting. It requires wetlands regulation. It requires funding. Remember, we talked about the funding. And there are other requirements as well. And we'll talk about one of the others a little bit later. So let's talk about the permitting. So These are called NIPTES permits. Federal Clean Water Act has a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit system. And there's generally 5 or 6 of them. I used to say 5 because I never included the CAFO program because we weren't actually permitting. But now I say 6 because last year you came up with that. And you'll only see 5 here because 6 is on the next page. Because six is a big one. So it's discharges from point sources. So discharges from a pipe, from your wastewater treatment plant, from a ditch, from a conveyance. Those types of discharges require a permit. Construction stormwater permit. If you are going to disturb 1 acre or more of land and just earth disturbance, and it's pretty much any kind of earth disturbance other than farming, then you have to comply with what's called the stormwater general permit. It's practices that you implement to control the runoff from that property. The multi-sector general permit's also a stormwater permit. This is controls for different categories of businesses. You know, think about it. If you're running a concrete plant, you have dust and waste, and if it rains, you need to control that so that doesn't run into your surface waters or groundwater. Municipal separate storm sewer permit, it's also a storm water permit. This is a requirement that municipalities of certain sizes implement certain stormwater controls, like street sweeping, like emptying catch basins, like education. So this is generally only for municipalities of a certain size, but I'm going to talk about how it's been used in Vermont. And then last, the concentrated animal feeding operation permit for certain farms that have an actual discharge or proposing an actual discharge. We dealt with that last year. You're going to see some requested changes from EPA this year, really kind of technical, but this isn't going away. You're going to be coming back to this program kind of regularly until it gets up and really operating smoothly. So what's that 6th permit? It's called residual designation authority, which means nothing when you look at it just on the language. But this is EPA and ANR. ANR has this authority to decide that certain discharges that might not require a permit under these 5 still require a permit. So when do they get to say that something that's not otherwise jurisdictionally requiring a permit needs a permit? Three areas. The discharge contributes to a violation of water quality standard. So the surface water that is discharging to is impaired, and this discharge is contributing to that impairment. ANR, EPA gets to say, hey, you need a permit, even though you didn't need a permit under the other NIPTES permits. The other is the discharge is a significant contributor of a pollutant to water. It's not even an impaired water. It's a significant contributor to any water. And then last, controls that are needed for the discharge based on waste load allocations that are part of a TMDL that address the pollutants of concern. Does this trigger anybody? Does anybody believe like, oh my God, triggers them, right? Why am I asking? Because when the state had to come up with controls to meet the EPA TMDL for Lake Champlain, they had to come up with a waste load allocation to show that the water was moving from impaired for phosphorus to something that was not impaired. And they developed a ton of waste load allocations that were not regulatorily required by the Clean Water Act. Is anybody thinking of one yet? The 3-acre permit. 3-acre permit is part of that waste load allocation. Now, that 3-acre permit wasn't required under residual designation authority. But if you take that 3-acre permit out of the waste load allocation, then you don't meet the TMDL anymore. And remember, it's not the state's TMDL, it's EPA's TMDL. What's the easiest thing for EPA to do if you repeal the 3-acre permit? Ho, 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 everybody still needs a permit. Because you're all part of a waste load allocation. We have the list. We know who you're gonna be. So if you're gonna amend the 3-acre permit, you're gonna have to be very careful about how you replace that waste load allocation so that EPA is agreeable to it. Otherwise, they have RDA. They can just say, well, it's great that you don't want it, but we do. And there you go. So you're in a bit of a box. Finding out what that waste load allocation substitute is going to be really important. And the secretary has said that, but she said it in very, very nice ways. Right? But I'm telling you, it's not so nice. So Clean Water Act permitting, it operates largely through those 5 programs with the RDA 6 as a hook. EPA may delegate that permitting to a state. And in 74, EPA delegated it to ANR. Approximately 47 states have been delegated. And one of the things that's, what does New Hampshire do? New Hampshire doesn't do all these permits. They didn't get delegated for everything. Maine didn't get delegated for everything. And so you will hear people saying, we can just do what Maine and New Hampshire did. But if you do that, you have to give up everything. You don't get to pick and choose. And I know that because 12, 13 years ago, ANR tried to get rid of underground injection control. And said, we don't want it anymore. We don't want to be delegated anymore. And EPA said, that's fine. Give us everything else. And we basically said, oh, well, we'll keep underground injection control. So think about that. Like somebody said, let's do what New Hampshire does. Let's do what Maine does. Well, that means giving up state control of these programs.
And to be clear, those states are still permitting. It's just the EPA is the
Just
permitting
EPA
agent.
doing the permit. And EPA still, on a delegated state, retains oversight over the state. So and this has happened, the state regulator says, hey, wastewater treatment plant, you need to meet this standard. And EPA said, no, that's not good enough. They need to meet this standard. And so EPA can come in and say to a state, you're not regulating adequately. They have that. But now outside of the Clean Water Act, there is multiple specific state-created programs. These are not driven by the Clean Water Act, not driven by the Safe Drinking Water Act. These are policy decisions that the General Assembly made to regulate these activities because the General Assembly determined it was necessary to protect surface water, environment, and public health. The first is the state stormwater operating permits. This is where if you're going to construct or expand new impervious surface by a ½ acre or more, you need to get an operating permit from ANR. That's an ongoing permit that is intended to ensure that stormwater running off your property is properly controlled. There's state permitting for activities in significant wetlands or buffers, and we're going to talk about that in a second. There's stream alteration permits for altering the course of the water course. After Irene, you saw tons and tons of equipment in the rivers. And to an extent, then the municipalities had authority to allow that. There was this really, really old statute that said municipal public works officials could approve flood control and dredging. And so one of those town managers were like, hey, go for it. And that was not appropriate according to ANR. And so that old authority has been removed. And if you're going to be doing activity in a water course, you're gonna need a stream alteration permit. You're probably gonna look at this in the DEC bill because they want a little bit of refinement of that program. Lake shoreland permits, this was almost the apocalypse when we were going through it. Property owners were infuriated. It requires some vegetated buffer around lake shorelands to help control water runoff. And it is, was a very difficult program to enact, but it has been running relatively smoothly, and been relatively successful. And then the state also has its own large farm and medium farm permit. After last year, if you're not a CAFO, you still may need to get a permit from the Agency of Agriculture in order to run your farm. And if you don't need a permit, you need to comply with the required agricultural practice. So another aspect of the Clean Water Act is its water quality. And this requires every state to establish its own standards for how the waters are going to be measured for water quality. And then the state has to regularly assess whether the state waters meet those standards. And if they don't, they have to develop a plan, usually a TMDL. There are a couple of other alternatives, but usually it's a TMDL to clean up waters that don't meet the standards. So what are the standards? So generally, the standards are based on the uses of the water. So what are the traditional uses of water in Vermont? And the Vermont Water Quality Standards have said it's public water supply, it's aesthetics, it's irrigation, it's fishing, it's boating, it's aquatic biota, swimming, aquatic habitat. Now you can add other things to this list. Like if you're in the Tennessee Valley, one of the things that's on this list is hydroelectric power. If you're out in Washington, one of the things is hydroelectric power and maybe even nuclear water cooling control. So like that's one of, you can add things as designated uses. To take a use away though is hard. To say that, oh, we need this activity and this activity is going to impair this use, and why don't we just get rid of that use so there won't be an impairment? That's hard. There's a process under the Clean Water Act called a use attainability analysis. You have to look and see whether or not you can meet that use and do that activity. And if you can't, you have to show what the significant economic justification is to eliminate that use. Not easy.
Sarita.
Yeah. So AI uses a tremendous amount of water. And I'm just wondering, like how is that regulated? Who says whether you can use water, public water for cooling down computers, or the technology?
So ANR will be doing that. So say you're drawing it from surface water, you have to discharge that water at some point. When you do that, that discharge needs to meet a certain standard. And that happened at Yankee. When Yankee was operating, they were bringing in water from the Connecticut and discharging it after it had cooled its reactor, and it had to meet a thermal standard before it could be discharged back in. If it's groundwater, it really depends on whether or not you use it all. Say it goes to steam, right? And then it's steamed off. Well, pretty much the thing that you're going to be regulated under that kind of activity is your extraction, how much you are extracting. If you're extracting more than, what is it, 43,000 gallons a day, something like that, you need a permit. It's called a large volume groundwater permit. And then when you release steam, you're potentially gonna need an air pollution control permit. So depending on your activity, you're likely going to be regulated by ANR. And if you're just pulling the water out and then applying it to land, well, a couple of years ago, you created a surface water permit
that's discharge, but what about use? I mean, can anybody just use, water in terms of, I mean, I understand they have to get a discharge, but
Well-
who kind of regulates?
That's a great question because I come back to that in one minute.
Mhm.
So when the states come up with a water quality standard, they base their standards on classification of the water. So each class water has different standards for what it's going to need to do in order to meet those traditional designated uses. So a higher water quality classification means that you are achieving those uses at a higher rate or a higher standard. And so and it's kind of intuitive in how the waters are classified. So in A1 water, the top, it's waters in their natural condition that have significant ecological value. They're meeting everything and they're meeting it at a high level. Similarly, class A2 that are suitable for public water source with only some disinfection or other required treatment. B1 waters in which one or more uses are demonstrably and consistently higher quality than class B2. And then class B2, it's good, but it's not as good as the other three. Right? And so the Vermont water quality standards basically have different standards for the different classes. And that's important because, well, first, most of the waters in Vermont are classified as B2. Guess who did that? You all did that. The General Assembly said, we're going to start with the default that all waters are good. We're not going to start with the default that all waters are that high A1 quality. But according to an ANR report, 2023, 139 waters currently are B2, but have standards, are meeting standards that qualify for a higher classification. And they should be reclassified. Why should they be reclassified? Because underneath the Clean Water Act and state law, if a water meets a standard for an existing use, that use must be maintained and protected. If it does not meet the standard, then the water is impaired and you have to bring that water back to the standard. So this is not just a concept, this is a requirement. It's called the anti-degradation policy. It's like you can't let water be degraded so that a use that it once supported is no longer supported. You have to maintain that use and you have to make sure that that water quality maintains that use. You can't let it degrade. Anti-degradation. So our state water quality standards have an anti-degradation policy. The federal law requires both the policy and an implementation. And you've asked for that implementation and rule since 2016. And it's not in rule. It's in a procedure at ANR. So one of the issues that's, I'll just say it's ongoing, is implementation of the anti-degradation policy, whether it should be by rule or some other method.
Michael, were you finished? Go ahead.
Sure.
On the 139 waters that currently meet a higher standard, don't they still have to meet that higher standard when someone comes in looking for a discharge?
Yeah, you can't let it degrade past that higher standard. If it's meeting it, they have to continue to meet it. But how they do that is not really transparent as it should be, because you didn't have a implementation that went through a public process. They adopted that procedure pretty much on their own. And so you didn't have these gentlemen providing comment on what it should do and how transparent it should be. And so it's there. They say they implement it.
We don't know how.
And could it be better? But it's not all bad. It's really not. Because the Clean Water Act requires A&R to go out every 2 years and to assess all the waters to determine what their status is. And they look at 7,100 miles of rivers and streams. You know, earlier you saw that there were 800 lakes. Well, now there's 446 lakes that are 10 acres or more and 206 that are over, really should be at 5 acres. There's 242,000 acres of lakes, reservoirs, and ponds, 300,000 acres of fresh water. Most of them meet the state standards. Some do not. And there are lists for those waters that don't meet standards. The big list is called the 303D list. And that's the list of waters that are impaired but don't have a TMDL and that need a TMDL. Now, water doesn't have to be impaired for the entire length and breadth or surface of the water. Just segments of that water can be determined to be impaired. And so when you look at the 303D list, it's pretty long. It's pretty long. But it's not, you know, the full river. It's a segment of the river. It's a part of the lake, a segment of the lake. But it's still pretty long. And the other one, the list I wanted to point out is the altered water. It used to be called stressed waters. I like the stressed waters better. They were stressed. But now they're altered. It's when something like an aquatic invasive or a flow issue, like drought, affects that water and creates pressure on the designated uses or the species in that water. So it's not necessarily impaired, but it's stressed. And you know how stress works. But so that's that list as well. And there are a couple of other lists also. But even though it's okay, pretty good, most waters are meeting standards, it's not all hunky-dory. And many of these water quality issues remain, whether it's anti-degradation implementation, whether it's 3 acre and how to balance that waste load allocation and the equity of it. It's CAFO. I said that that's going to be coming back to you from time to time regularly. Reclassification, what's going to happen with those 139 waters? Should they be reclassified? When? How? That's going to be a big rule if it is. But other issues that are ongoing need to be addressed by the General Assembly, the courts, or the relevant agencies. And they include something called Section 401. Remember earlier I said that there's other aspects of the Clean Water Act that aren't permitting, aren't water quality standards, aren't funding. This isn't really a permit. It's just the state saying that something meets the water quality standards. And what is the something? It's when a proposed federal license or permit involves an activity that may discharge into waters of the United States. This is called the 401 cert. And you'll see here, it's any time that there's going to be any activity that results in a discharge into a navigable water, the permitting agency, the federal permitting agency, has to seek a certification from the state, which the discharge originates, that it meets all of these numbers. All those numbers are the Clean Water Act requirements for water quality standards, effluent limitations, product, biota. So it's basically meeting the water quality standard. And the state is supposed to provide it within a reasonable period of time, which shall not exceed 1 year. Now, the courts have kind of given states some leeway there, but the administration has been trying to push back on that. So this can be a controversial issue. And so A&R DEC is the entity that runs the 401 CERT program. And you'll see if you're going to need a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers for Rivers and Harbors Act, or Army Corps of Engineers for wetland discharge, from FERC for a hydroelectric power license. So if you need any of those permits from the feds, you have to go to A&R to get a 401 certification. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to meet all the standards exactly when you apply for the cert. A&R can say, hey, you meet most of our standards, but you don't meet this one. But if you do this with your activity, you'll meet our standard. So it's like, it's approval and sometimes with conditions, and actually most of the times with condition. And those conditions can cause some digestive issues. It can some regulatory issues. It's like, because, for example, you're looking at, right now, you required a study over the past 4 years to about whether the state should assume ownership of the Green River Dam and dike in order to maintain the Green River State Park. Well, why were you looking? Because the Morrisville Water and Light had a dam at Green River that was producing hydroelectric power, but their FERC license was up. Now, FERC licenses can range from 5 years to 40 years. So Morrisville had, I think they had a 35-year permit. But what happens in 35 years? I mean, I've been here for almost 25 and I've seen a ton of shit happen. And you know, you're gonna see things that change a lot in 35 years. And among those are the water quality standards and how those are going to be applied to a hydroelectric project using a surface water for its power. And when A&R reviewed the Green River application for a renewal of its FERC permit, they said, hey, you generally meet the standards, but we need these conditions for you to implement in order to meet all of the standards. And one of them was about aquatic habitat. So in the winter time, Morrisville was drawing down the lake, drawing down the reservoir in order to have it operate they were allowed to draw it down up to about 10 feet. And that allowed them to continue operating in an economical way to generate power without creating issues for its future or driving up rates for its ratepayer. Well, A&R and its 401 first said, no, you can't draw it down. Can't draw it down in the winter time anymore because it's clear that there's aquatic habitat that's available that when you draw it down by that, you damage, and therefore the water is impaired for aquatic habitat. They subsequently went to say, oh, 1.5, and Green and Morrisville said, oh, we'll be happy with 6. And they litigated that. And the Supreme Court said that A&R had the authority to require the 1.5. And Morrisville said, well, we can't operate it economically anymore. And so they surrendered their FERC license. They no longer have a license to generate power. And this study was to look at what options there are. One of the options is the state takes ownership, runs the dam, maybe gets a hydroelectric permit of its own, maybe not. But the Green River State Park would continue. Morrisville Power and Light, Water and Light wouldn't have the liability issues that come with owning a dam, which we'll probably talk about later in the session. And so, but this report didn't recommend anything. It just said, these are your 4 alternatives. It's like classic. But one of the things that they're one of the alternatives, remove the dam. Take the dam out. If the dam's a liability, then take it out. What's that do to the Green River State Park? That would require redesign of that park. So that's how 401s can affect activity in your state. It's not a permit, it's not a license. It's just a certification that you meet a certain standard, but it can really affect how an activity is ongoing. And remember, FERC licenses 5 to 40 years. How many more of these are gonna happen? What other dams that are producing electricity right now will be subject to something like this? It's a real possibility. And you'll see there's controversy over the 401 and whether or not it's weaponized. There was members of congressional New York districts who wanted Governor Hochul to basically use water quality certifications to kill a natural gas pipeline, which of course drove certain people in the current administration a little bit crazy. And they were like, no, you have to use water quality certifications to ensure water quality, not as a land use tool. It's not something that you can use as an alternative regulatory device. And that's what this letter from Peggy Brown from May of 2025 said. Don't do that. Focus on using it for water quality. But at the same time, the current administration they're holding public stakeholder processes to look at whether or not the certification process should go back to what it was a couple of years ago. And the advocates are basically saying, and it's not just, this is like an attorney general from Washington, huge state with huge hydroelectric power. They're like, don't change it. We know how it works. We know how it works in Washington. You don't need to keep ping-ponging it back and forth. Just keep it the way it is because we know how to do it because we've been doing it this way for 50 years. But you still have this concern about its weaponization, which is real. It's real. Now let's talk wetlands and the executive order promoting housing construction rehabilitation. I think most of you, if not all of you, are aware of it and how it intended, at least in part or part of it, to streamline environmental review, especially with regard to development in wetlands. And the key provisions in the EO said that Class 2 wetlands are limited to those features identified on the most current Vermont significant wetlands inventory, and no state wetland permits are required for impacts to unmapped Class 2 wetlands. We'll talk about why that's an issue in a second. The other thing that the EO said is that the buffer zones around Class 2 wetlands are reduced to 25 feet. Said the projects must comply with federal wetland requirements. And then A&R shall commence rulemaking to ensure that those wetlands provisions are established and ruled prior to the expiration of this executive order. Well, this is a significant policy decision. But you are the supreme policymakers for the state. That's what the Constitution says. You are the one that make the policy decisions, and then you delegate authority to state agencies to implement that. Well, well, here's, before I get to the statute, when A&R looked at the EO, they basically said that they couldn't do it immediately. They couldn't do what the EO says do immediately, and that they need to amend rule in order to implement that EO. And they say until the rule is adopted and the current Vermont wetland rules are in place. So they realized, hey, we can't do this on our own. We have to go through a delegated process. But statute controls over. So even if they adopt rules, those rules have to be consistent with statute. And that's important because statute says if a person's going to conduct or allowed to be conducted an activity in a significant wetland, they need approval from DEC to do so. And a significant wetland means any Class 1 or Class 2 wetland. Class 1 wetland is only created by rule. It is not easy to do. And it has significant restrictions on what you can do in its class one wetland. So there's not a ton of class one wetlands, and you don't mess with them because of the significant restrictions on that. So what we are talking about are class two wetlands. And what's a class two wetland? It's a wetland other than a class one or class three wetland. And I wrote that and I read that. It's a wetland identified on the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory map. It's on the map, like the EEO said, hey, things that are on the map are gonna be still subject to the permit. Or the secretary determines to merit protection pursuant to section 914, which is where the secretary can develop determinations that land is a wetland based upon evaluation of the functions and values that are set forth in statute for what a wetland is. So what does that mean? So right now, you look at the map and you see the map. The map is not dispositive. You still have to, if you're going to develop, go out and assess your property to see whether it's a wetland, because it could meet those functions and values and could, according to the secretary, merit protection under a wetlands determination. Because the maps then and now are not 100% accurate. Back when this was drafted, there were farm roofs on the maps. There were swimming pools on the maps. And then there were large swamps that weren't on the maps. So using the maps as a dispositive determinator then and still now creates questions. In addition, you, the General Assembly, defined what a buffer zone is for a class two wetland. You said it's 50 feet from the border of the wetland unless the secretary determines otherwise under section 914. Section 914 is when the secretary determines, according to the functions and values, whether or not a wetland exists. So that's not supposed to happen anymore. So how do you get to reduce a 50-foot buffer if you're not doing the wetlands determination? Because the EO tells you not to do the wetlands determination. So how? I really don't understand that. And that misunderstanding or lack of understanding was communicated to your legislative leadership. And they asked the Attorney General for an advisory opinion on whether or not the EO had conflicts with statute, whether or not it created separation of powers issue. And they agreed. They said the statute applies to significant wetlands, which include a class two wetland, that's either one identified on the map or that the secretary determines requires protection. That's statute. You can't change that just by rule or by an EO. Neither the secretary nor the governor, however, can unilaterally create new categorical exceptions to wetlands permitting, like a 25-foot buffer instead of a 50-foot buffer, because statute requires that permitting exemptions be created by rule. So if you're going to allow housing in a non-mapped wetland, or if you're going to allow a 25-foot buffer instead of a 50-foot buffer for class two, the AG said you got to do that within the confines of your authority, which might include rule, but the EO wasn't a rule. But at the same time, they don't give the secretary authority to immediately and categorically have the statutory 50-foot presumptive wetland zone. And I need to remind you that even if they go to 25 feet, even if they say that the statute allows them to adopt rules that define allowed uses or to lower a buffer, the statute is still going to say 50 feet. The statute's still going to say the secretary has authority to determine. You're still going to have potential conflict between statute and rule, depending on what they draft. And they have a draft out there. And it adds the construction of residential housing projects and related utilities as an allowed use in a wetland. there are a lot of allowed uses, but this is the longest allowed use I've ever seen. So.
It allows construction,
Mhm.
go ahead, say that again, it allows.
So
construction of resident in a wetland. Huh, that's-
it allows construction in a wetland if you're in one of these areas designated downtowns, et cetera, tier 1 or tier B, tier 1A or tier 1B. If you're eligible for interim housing exemptions under Act 250. And the project is located 25 feet or more outside of a class 2 wetland, so they just have the buffer. And, or it's in a contiguous unmapped class 2 wetland, or it's in any unmapped class 2 wetland. So the secretary's determination is gone. The authority to determine whether or not an unmapped class 2 wetland is unnecessary for this type of development. And this is just a draft. But I do think you're gonna have continued conflict with statute, at least with interpretations. That just look at the statute versus the rule. I do think if you want to do this, I would recommend making some statutory changes. But that's if you want to do it. Remember, you're the supreme policymaker. You get to make those decisions. And I'm just not making this up. This is a cartoon from A&R's own website where it shows what the existing wetlands rules say. Hey, this is the wetland on the map. This is the wetland not on the map. You have to send out a wetland professional to do the delineation. And a residential project has to either avoid that wetland or be outside the 50-foot buffer. But this is what they're proposing. It's only, there's a wetland on the map. You don't need to send the wetlands professional out to do the delineation. You can actually construct in that wetland as long as you're 25 feet away from the mapped wetland. So you have your cattails growing through your patio there in the wetland. So this is what they want to do. This is pretty basic. So that's again for you to determine. If you, the supreme policymaker, want this to happen, you are the one that can opine on. And what's another issue that's out there right now?
Representative Sakowicz has a question.
Pardon?
Representative Sakowicz.
Yeah, just going back to that slide for a second, Michael. So again, I just want to make sure I'm clear that this 25 feet here on this cartoon is 25 feet from where the map says the border is, not necessarily where that wetland actually is. Like the wetland
Correct.
could really be in a very different spot,
Very,
but
yeah.
because we're relying on maps, which we know aren't always accurate, that's what we're going to use as our reference here.
And you also have to remember that the person I know that told me this used a certain term. She said that wetlands breathe. Like they expand and they contract. They expand and they contract. It doesn't mean that when they're contracted that the area out there that's wet when it's expanded isn't a wetland. It's still a wetland. But they breathe, they change. And so you won't have that change reflected on the map.
They change more now with drought to flood to drought to flood.
So again, that's a decision for you all to make.
Representative Austin.
I'm just wondering flooding. I mean, in terms of, is there another map for flooding, for flood zones or flooding that, how do they align with this or not align? with this?
Great question. They do potentially align with this. So a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, you looked at two programs in the state that are related to flooding. One is the National Flood Insurance Program. You had just gotten through a couple of years of flooding where municipalities were really taxed with how they would respond to the FEMA NFIP requirements. They said they didn't have the expertise, and those municipalities that did have the expertise said it was really difficult anyway. And so you asked the A&R to complete a study committee to look at whether or not the state should take on NFIP and how they should take on NFIP. Because other states do that. Other states, especially smaller states, regulate the National Flood Insurance Program from a state level. So your municipalities don't have to take on that responsibility. The other thing you did is what's called river corridor development permitting. Now, the river corridor is wider, or should be wider than the NFIP flood zone. So NFIP is about inundation flooding. It's like the Mississippi, like, oh, it rained in Minnesota 3 weeks ago, so we know Arkansas is going to be flooded in 2.5 weeks. And so you can predict where it's going to be and how it's going to rise. It's not that Vermont doesn't get that kind of flooding, but the flooding that really does damage in Vermont is called fluvial erosion flooding. It's those specific, discrete, very high volume events that pour tons of water on an area in a short amount of time and scour out that area, blow out your roads, et cetera, et cetera. And those risks are mapped through what are called river corridor maps. You directed the agency to start permitting development in those mapped river corridors. So wetlands can be in those mapped river corridors. They can be in the NFIP flood zone. So they do overlap, and honestly, the river corridor development permit they're probably gonna have to decide whether or not you don't need to go get a wetland permit if you're in the river corridor. You just need the river corridor permit, and that's enough. So that's how they are. I mean, it's.
Yes. Thank you.
Representative North.
Just to clarify that, so the flood zone, the river corridor maps and the wetland maps are separate and distinct maps, but permitting relative to each is separate and distinct.
Right, so for NFIP, you don't necessarily need a permit, you need to comply with FEMA's rules. And your municipality has to have an ordinance that complies with FEMA's rules. So a couple of years ago, somebody decided that, FEMA decided that Vermont wasn't complying with FEMA's rules because Vermont municipalities don't regulate, or until last year, didn't regulate farming. And FEMA said, well, farming is development, because if you look at the definition of FEMA's definition of development, it's anything that's going to change the elevation of that flood zone by, I think it's like six inches. And so it can be farming, it can be storage, putting your hay bales, putting your logs, your cut logs. Those are all potentially development to FEMA, and municipalities weren't regulating. So you had to do this whole kind of backwards somersault to regulate that at the state level in order to appease FEMA. But they're all different programs.
I guess I'm trying to make a point that the changes in the way development is proposed to occur relative to wetlands shouldn't take into account, well, what might happen during flood, because that floodplain is a different thing than a wetland. So if we're talking about 25-foot buffers from a wetland is a wetland, not a wetland when it floods. So it's just the wetland is a wetland and a flood zone is a flood zone. Two separate things.
But if a wetland's in a river corridor area, and you want to build,
Agreed, there would be 2 or maybe 3,
right,
permits required depending on the.
or you figure out a way to streamline that so that maybe you don't need 2 permits if you're in a river corridor.
They are separate now.
And can I ask a completely separate, but kind of just a technical legal question? which slide is this on? Back when you're talking about the Title 10 VSA 902 that talks about the definition of a class 2 wetland. Just from a technical legal standpoint, where it says class 2 wetland means a wetland other than class 1 or class 3, that colon, and then there's two things. Second one of which the secretary determines to merit protection pursuant. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say it doesn't say anywhere that the secretary shall determine the merit. It's almost like that's an option. So
It is an option.
it's an option. So if some other mechanism comes in place and determines that something is or isn't a wetland, since this isn't a shall, it's just an option. So it's not violating, is it? Or, and I'm just asking for a technical legal question.
It would depend, I think, on the facts on the ground for each case, right? Like if you said, oh, I looked at it, looked at the maps and my parcel wasn't a wetland, went forward with construction, turns out your parcel wasn't a wetland, you haven't violated anything. But if you go forward and you build in that wetland, and it was a wetland, but it was unmapped, you potentially have violated that. You conducted an activity or allowed an activity in a class 2 wetland without the secretary's authority.
I think I get your question, and I think the linchpin is the functions and values. Secretary has the obligation to protect the functions and values of a wetland, whether it's mapped or not. And the way I get it, because I have the same thought, like, well, this allows the secretary to decide.
Yeah.
But the secretary is, and the way we've been using this section of statute, and also I think it's because it's based on the functions and values, is their staff goes out and decides, based on functions and values of evaluation, is this a wetland or not? And then the secretary has determined it is. So it isn't actually optional, but it is oddly worded
Yeah.
from a normal person's.
You also understand that DEC, they traditionally have enforced this pretty tight. So they'll go out and look at an activity, and one of the things, so see if it meets the functions and values, whether it's on the map. The other thing they look at is whether it's an activity that's an allowed use. So for example, you can have a horse corral in a wetland, but you can't have a dog park. Because the rules say you can have a horse corral, but the rules don't say you can have a dog park. And so it can be pretty refined in how they look at the activity, and whether or not they require.
Those are the rules developed through the rules procedures.
Yeah. Yep, there's 29 allowed uses, I think. When you break them all down. There's 2 exemptions. But I can't even explain that. So let's talk about the other big issue that you might hear about or that courts will have to address. And it's subsurface tile. And you probably have seen media that there was a citizen suit that was brought against the farm in Vergennes, Panton, that said that the subsurface tile drains from that farm included pollutants that were not permitted under the Federal Clean Water Act. In order to discharge pollutants under the Clean Water Act, you need a NIPDES permit for discharge of wastewater. And let's talk about how the Clean Water Citizen Suit provision works. It says any citizen can bring a claim against someone that they believe is violating the Clean Water Act or against the administrator or delegated state when they're not doing something that's non-discretionary. But when you are going to file a citizen suit, you have to give that regulator notice and you have to give them time to respond in an appropriate way to exercise their enforcement or to do what they have as a non-discretionary duty. The citizen, the advocates bringing this gave A&R authority, gave A&R notice of this suit, and A&R didn't do anything. And why? Because it's kind of novel. Because the question of subsurface tile drains is ping pong back and forth. Is it, in some instances, a discharge into a conveyance that goes into water and therefore requires a permit? Yes. In some cases, no. It's not going directly into a water, or no, because there's no actual introduction of the pollutant from outside of the soil. And therefore, is it an irrigated return flow, or is that an agricultural stormwater exemption? There is a case in California, just whatever, late August, September, that said, no, it's not a discharge, but it's really factually different. It was like a large agricultural watershed with this weird aquifer that they use subsurface tile drains not to impact. And so this is going to be a novel question in Vermont. And if it's determined that subsurface tile drains need permits,
Got global impact.
so we're probably going to need a lot of money. Somebody is.
Clean water.
And so that's I mean, I was pretty excited. I was like, whoa, this is novel. I like the novel stuff. I have no interest in how it gets resolved. I'm just interested in that it's novel. Like, I don't care one way or the other, but it's going to be pretty interesting to see how it plays out. And there are still so many other issues. It's everywhere. I mean, they're there with the water. You got the dam safety rules, which are a little late, but they're coming. You got the riparian corridor rules, which we were just talking about. NFIP, you have the wastewater system and potable water supply permitting for housing. Our septic and well permitting systems is a health-based standard. It's not just a default length. It's not, hey, your isolation distance is 75 feet for everyone. Ours is based on what risk is posed by your system based on the site condition and the size and the type. And so that can limit housing. And so people are saying, hey, let's look at a way to refine that. You got PFAS standards, there's drinking water, groundwater, it's gonna happen on Thursday, but you also have to look at surface water discharge standards. The people from Lake Memphremagog, they don't like that there's potential for PFAS, even treated PFAS, to be discharged into their surface water.
It's so wrong.
You have the flood response and resilience, which is ongoing and really ongoing, depending on what town you're in. We kind of skipped over Lake Champlain TMDL implementation, but that's a big driver of everything. You have 3 acre, we talked about that, aquatic nuisance control, use of waters, wake boats, water supply, public access, and then drought and what that did to public water systems and agriculture, whether it recurs. You're gonna see a bill probably on the floor in a couple of weeks about setting up a special fund to provide farmers with funding when they have weather-related losses. So it's everywhere.
Fluoride.
Chloride's not on there.
That's all.
No,
Alum.
Alan, we're gonna do it.
Alum's not on there.
Anyway, that was awesome. Thank you, Michael. Any final questions for legislative council before we take a break? Okay, let's take oh, yes, Representative, hold on.
This is my first day.
Wait, I just wanna call on you, but also get your name in my head, Representative Hoyt.
What's a TMDL?
It's an acronym for total maximum daily load. And it's the target when your water is impaired, say, let's use Champlain, oh, let's use Connecticut, you're from down there. The Long Island Sound is impaired for, it's got a hypoxic zone. And so it's just a dead zone. And it's due to nitrogen. And so ultimately, there will be a target that Vermont will need to reach for nitrogen reduction in order for the sound. So that target it's really just a waste load allocation. We're going to be allocated an amount of nitrogen that the state will need to reduce in order to meet the Long Island Sound targets to eliminate that hypoxic zone. What we will do, I don't know. I mean, large sources are wastewater treatment plants, stormwater runoff. The state has done a lot on both of those for nitrogen control. You can't apply nitrogen fertilizer anymore as a residential user. And farmers are very sensitive to it now as well. And so I don't know what's gonna be required for Vermont, but ultimately, according to EPA, which is coordinating that TMDL, we're gonna get a target that we're gonna have to meet.
Thank you.
All right, let's take a 10-minute break, come back at 10 minutes to 3, and we'll hear from Jared and John.